Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. Marcus Aurelius said, "Everything we hear is an opinion, not a fact. Everything we see is a perspective, not the truth." Without carbon dioxide, there would be no life on Earth. The process of photosynthesis combines carbon dioxide, water, chlorophyll in the leaves, and sunlight to produce plant growth. Many commercial greenhouse operators increase the amount of carbon dioxide inside the greenhouse because it increases plant growth and also makes them more drought resistant. In 1920, Scientific American wrote an article, "Fertilizing the Air with Carbon Dioxide to Promote Plant Growth." They did an experiment where they pumped carbon dioxide from an industrial facility into an area where they were growing crops. And they showed a huge increase in crop yields, which means lots more food for the world. But the United Nations has a completely different story about carbon dioxide. They say, if carbon emissions remain high, it could be up to twice as deadly as cancer in some parts of the world. The study gives an example of Dhaka, Bangladesh, where under a scenario of very high emissions by the year 2100, additional deaths due to climate change could rise to nearly twice the country's current annual death rate from all cancers and 10 times its annual road traffic fatalities. Apparently, the United Nations doesn't know much about the history of Bangladesh. In 1970, Bangladesh, which was called East Pakistan at the time, was hit by the deadliest storm in modern history. Cyclone Bola killed up to 500,000 people in what is now called Bangladesh. The Great Bola Cyclone of 1970 produced a storm surge of 34.8 feet or 10.6 meters. People weren't worried about global warming in 1970. They were worried about global cooling and a new ice age. New York Times, July 18, 1970. U.S. and Soviet press studies of a colder Arctic. The United States and the Soviet Union are mounting large-scale investigations to determine why the Arctic climate is becoming more frigid, why parts of the Arctic sea ice have recently become ominously thicker, and whether the extent of that ice cover contributes to the onset of ice ages. And scientists wanted to sprinkle coal dust on the Arctic ice pack in order to melt it. The deadliest storm in world history wasn't associated with global warming, rather it was associated with global cooling. The highest storm surge in the Bay of Bengal occurred in the year 1876. The storm surge was 44.6 feet high or 13.6 meters. At that time, there was a terrible heat wave and drought which killed 10 million people in India, 20 million people in China, and as many as 1 million people in Brazil. People in China were selling their children because they couldn't afford to feed them and couldn't afford to feed themselves. There were so many people dying, the corpses were left on the ground and they were devoured by birds and beasts. What caused this drought was the largest El Niño on record, and it was combined with the highest ever value of the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation. Before they hit all the data prior to 1910, the Australian Bureau of Meteorology listed the highest temperature ever in New South Wales as being 52.8 C at Burke on January 17, 1877. During the winter of 1877 to 1878, Minnesota had no winter weather. In the 2 years famine of 1877 and 1878, it's estimated that 9.5 million people starved to death in China. China had a major famine almost every year since the year 108 BC. In 1878, a universal drought was reported. The Sydney Morning Herald reported that the drought had prevailed for many months in almost every portion of the southern hemisphere. From 1874 to 1876, the eastern half of the United States was in drought. There was a terrible heat wave reported in St. Louis. The heat in New South Wales was described as being extraordinary. The United Nations is making completely fake claims about death rates and how carbon dioxide affects extreme events. The worst droughts and famines in world history occurred when carbon dioxide levels were much lower. The reality is that life expectancy has more than doubled over the last 120 years. Death rates from cancer are about 200 times higher than death rates from all types of natural disasters, including all geophysical, meteorological, and climate events. Now let's look at the fake science behind the United Nations claim. In the year 2000, NASA showed 1878 as being the warmest year prior to 1980. And they showed no trend in temperatures from 1870 to 1975. But they've since altered the data, erased 1878, and produced a non-existent warming trend. And Michael Mann, who erased the medieval warm period, erased the Little Ice Age, and created the completely fraudulent hockey stick, is now trying to erase the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation as well. There is zero scientific evidence supporting the hysterical claims of the United Nations. The most extreme events around Bangladesh occurred when carbon dioxide levels were much lower. The UN's speculations are based on worthless models created on a foundation of junk science. The historical record does not support any of their ideas. Toto's been pulling back the curtain on this scam for the past 14 years. You can visit him, Kyrie Caesar, Toki and Upla on the web at realclimatescience.com.